Hi class, today we are starting the final unit of the course and Rawls is a great way to do it. But before we say that, more generally, there's some very clear and interesting connections between ethics and policies that is governmental policies. So obviously people have thoughts about ethics regarding the death penalty, abortion, etc., even though strictly speaking political philosophy and political science are not ethics. However, there is an overlap, and Rawls is a good way to introduce us to that overlap, and it has to do with justice. There is something wrong, morally, with being unjust. And so, when we're talking about ethics within politics, the discussion tends to center on justice, that if you're losing justice, you're obviously doing something morally blameworthy, or perhaps even if you're supporting or voting for something that is unjust, you are doing something blameworthy as well. So that's kind of a big picture connection of how do ethics and politics fit together, but that's also an explanation for why we start with Rawls. So Rawls has a very large book called A Theory of Justice, of which you are reading snippets. Hopefully you've already read that, and hopefully you skipped the one I told you to skip. But more generally, everything in the Rawls is actually in a very compact form in the first section in our text, in section 3. And the rest is just unpacking and defending and things like that. And so if things seem a little redundant, that's why. More importantly, though, for the purposes of this course, Rawls gives us a framework. And our goal should be to understand that framework. Yeah, we can talk about the nuts and bolts, whether he's right or not, but we should also be talking about application. That if Rawls is right, this has these consequences for this policy or that principle, etc. And so, especially on the discussion boards, I'd really love to see some application of Rawls' two principles of justice to whatever you feel like talking about, some very relevant issues in contemporary US, etc. And so that would be very helpful and a lot of fun. Also notice that Rawls contrasts his view with the utilitarians, and so you could build that in as well, and then he also sees his view as coming out of Kant's to some degree. So it's a good summative end of the year, since there is a cumulative section on the final. It's nice that he hits two of the theories we've actually three, because he mentions Aristotle and perfectionism. So he's really hits all three of the major metaethical theories. Anyway, enough effusing about the reading. Let's talk about what's actually going on. Rawls is a contractarian. He thinks that society is and should be based on a contract, and our principles of justice should derive from that contract. And so his first thing is to try to generalize. So a lot of contractarians have written before, and he's trying to get the most basic, most general, and then see what that has to look like, and then kind of rebuild moving forward, which is why the book is really long. But anyway, he says that any contractarian approach is based on an original agreement. It's important, just every contractarian points this out, but if you're new to contractual, social contracts and such, there's no such thing. These are imaginary, these are thought experiments. It's not like anyone thinks that a society started by a bunch of people getting together and saying, yes, we're going to live in that way. That doesn't take away from the value. Just be aware we're talking philosophy and ethics rather than history and sociology. So we have an original agreement in which, let me even pause there. Rawls doesn't really hit this, but why would this help? Because if we think in terms of what people would agree to in certain conditions, that kind of tells, not kind of, that very explicitly tells us what we can and should expect from a government. If in this original agreement you would not agree to X, that's a very good indicator that the government doing X is wrong. And so these thought experiments can tell us Well, why would we come together and agree to society of a certain form to begin with? Is a tax at assent, and that's the kind of thing that we are assenting to our government doing. And so it's actually a very, very useful way of thinking, even though it's not historical. And I dare say it's way more useful than historical. Well, his dad killed his dad, so here we all are, is not the best way to figure out political philosophy. So um, that's what we're doing overall. Again, he calls that the original agreement. Overall, he says, what would we assent to? It's what free, rational people would accept in their own self-interest. We don't get into society to be altruistic. So, what would a rational person who is interested in their own ability uh, freely assent to? And this gets to his very central notion of justice, which he calls justice as fairness, that fairness is really the central key component of justice. And so, how would we get at that, asks Rawls. The general idea is we would start with what he calls the original position. Well, what would we agree to initially? Um, and here's something interesting Rawls does. He says we must choose from what's later called a veil of ignorance. That in order to get at fairness, think of how you would make these decisions if you didn't know anything about yourself. If you didn't know your status, or your religion, or your race, or your sexual orientation and identity, gender, et cetera, et cetera. If you didn't know any of these things, that's how we get at fairness. And he'll defend that a little later. But notice, if we don't know what we are, then we're not going to agree to policies that harm some group that's not ourselves. That's really the key. Well, if I don't know if I don't know I'm rich, then I'm certainly not going to agree to a policy that helps the rich at the expense of the poor, et cetera, et cetera. And so this, he says, this notion of justice as fairness comes the closest to what would be a voluntary free society. There's no such thing in a strict sense as a voluntary free society. We're all in too many ways stuck given the world. But this comes closest, and he'll defend that a little later. But for now, he says that this concept is going to immediately spit out two principles. What kind of things would you agree to behind a veil of ignorance? First of all, equal basic rights and duties. Nobody's going to agree to surrender those. But then second, uh, nobody. We're not going to agree to absolute equality necessarily. Instead, he says that inequalities are only going to be allowed if they benefit everyone, especially the least well off. And again, that comes from, if we're assuming a veil of ignorance, I have to assume the worst. That if something is harming the least well off, then it's not going to be something that I would adhere to if I don't know if I'm part of that group. So he doesn't make it explicit in section 3, but notice that there's also this kind of risk averseness built in as well. And so that's the really, really big picture summary of what Rawls is going to be defending in the rest of the work. That justice is fairness. We get at justice by thinking as if we're in an original position behind a veil of ignorance. When we do that, it's going to spit out his two principles, equal rights and duties, at least basic ones, and inequalities are only going to be permissible, that is assented to, if they benefit everyone, especially the least well off. He's going to note that's very different from utilitarianism. You could probably already start to see how, but we'll get there. So the only other things I want to add from section 4, because it's kind of just a little bit of extra building. First of all, he's going to separate from a group that, specifically Kantians in some way, that thinks that the principles of justice can just be deduced from a priori principles. He thinks that there's too much about the world and there's too many principles we need. Think of all the things we need in society. Um, and he says, so justice is instead mutually supported by many considerations. So justice is this kind of maximum pact principles thing. Second of all, he introduces the terminology of reflective equilibrium. You should probably be aware of what he means by that. He basically calls it's the initial situation. So when we're in the original position and we kind of figure out all of our principles, that's what he means by reflective equilibrium. He says it's the initial situation and the reasonable conditions and considered principles or principles with a little tweaking that reflect our justice principles. So it's reflective because we've thought about it a bit. One thing that he very briefly mentions earlier but emphasizes later, one of the things we're ignorant of is our own concept of good. And you say, why is that important? Just think of a religious zealot who says, well, the number one thing for me is my religion, and so I am happy to vote a policy that is terrible for 88% of Americans because it supports my religion. Those are the kind of things we have to kind of prune, he uses the word, and refine, is to say, well, wait a minute, if we're actually in the original position, we would not agree to that kind of thing because you don't have a clear concept of this kind of highest good that is somehow independent of all these other considerations. And as such, that would be part of the, so setting those things aside is part of the original position, and that's what we mean by kind of reflecting on pruning and improving our justice principles. So, that's actually also an interesting thing that, at least in the readings we have, Rawls doesn't defend a lot. Should we set aside that kind of view? The general motivation is to say, well, because we're not talking ethics, we're talking about something a little larger. We're talking about justice within a society. So if you put it in that context, there's some interesting things to talk about there if you want to. But anyway, he then goes on to show how this is different than utilitarianism. And we know enough about utilitarianism to say, well, here's the issue with utilitarianism is you might see it in terms of that first principle that everyone has these basic minimal rights and duties. A utilitarian, in some senses, is willing to, I hate to use the word suppress, but set aside rights for the greater good. That's right out of the utilitarian playbook, that if it is genuinely the case that the greater good means setting aside these rights in order for the benefit of all, we should do it. And I say genuinely because remember our mill, we have to be careful not to strawman mill. There's some utilitarian consequences to setting aside rights. There absolutely are. And so a lot of these kind of stereotype utilitarianisms, well, if you set aside rights in too harsh a manner, you're actually decreasing utility. But having said that, there are cases in which setting aside a right might increase the overall good. When we were reading some of the earlier applied ethics this semester, we read examples such as, well, burning down somebody's house to stop a fire from spreading might be an example of a right that is suppressed in order for the group good. Anyway, but the payoff difference for Rawls is the utilitarian is really not taking the view of every individual looking out for themselves, but from one impartial spectator looking to the whole society. And that has differences in terms of, well, if this one policy makes the least well off a little bit worse, but in fact massively increases the utility of everybody else, you do a utility calculus there, and it's going to spit out positive utility, which means it's a good policy. Rawls thinking, because we're risk averse and we don't know who we are, we basically have to assume we're the least well off, would not allow that. And so that's where they're going to disagree about. It's not simple utility calculus. Instead, we have to focus on the least well off category. Interestingly enough, as an aside, as we're talking about this, think of things like capitalism is an interesting thing to talk about because Rawls is fine with capitalism in a qualified sense, as are most people. That, well, as long as letting you make billions and billions of dollars also benefits the least well off significantly, then go for it. And we can have lots of cases like that. So think of Rockefeller, who basically made his fortune by making life better for everybody else, by allowing a cheap light source that basically let us stay up after dark. And so that's gas lighting before we had electric lighting. Anyway, so don't think that Rawls and the utilitarians are super far apart on those kind of cases. It's only when we have this, unbridled capitalism actually cutting into and making life worse for the least well off. Maybe think in terms of monopolies and things like that. That's where Rawls is going to pump the brakes pretty hard. So, but again, if you want to talk about more specific principles, say tax structures, things like that, love to hear about them in the discussion boards. And then I'm at about section 11 now, so if you're following along in order. So again, he's defending and unpacking his version of justice. And in this section, he's very explicit that unlike utilitarianism, the first principle will be prior to the second always. That is, if an inequality benefits quite a bit at the expense of losing basic rights, that's a no. The utility calculus doesn't matter. Having said that, he qualifies that a little. He thinks that if people are willing, or I should say would be willing, to trade away some of their rights, maybe some of their minor rights, for very beneficial inequalities, that's fine too. So what kind of things are we talking about there? Well, if people are willing to trade away their right to not have to wear a face covering in public and thereby save the economy and hundreds of thousands of lives, that's probably fine. That's not really a basic right, and it's one that people would be willing to trade as a rule. So, so he does defend that. But notice also we get that good definition of injustice now. Now that all this stuff is in play, an injustice is simply an inequality that is not beneficial to all. And so, and again, especially the least well off, but he doesn't mention it there. Why? Well, it comes out of his definition, but again, think of the original position. The original position is at a reflective equilibrium, which means if we start there, we should not be willing to make society worse, which means the only inequalities we would allow are ones that make society better, that benefit the least well off. And so the original position is what he calls the benchmark for improvement. And so as such, if we're taking a step back instead of a step forward from that original position, that's an injustice. So an inequality that is not beneficial to all. Love to hear your talk. If people want to give some examples of that in the discussion board, etc. It is interesting. Notice he doesn't explicitly say, well, taking away someone's basic right is not an injustice, but notice that's entailed. That because the first principle is prior to the second, that an inequality that does take away someone's basic right, say right to life or right to freedom, right to property, by definition, that would actually be an inequality that is not beneficial to all. And so definitionally taking away rights for some reason or other, would still fall under that injustice one. He didn't make that explicit here, but it was worth mentioning. So just going to add 2 more things and we'll call it a day on Rawls. And again, I really want to hear your applications here. 2, democracy falls pretty straightforwardly out of this because democracy gives fair opportunity. Think of any other system of government, say a monarchy. Well, if I'm behind a veil of ignorance and I don't know whether I'm going to be a king or a peasant, then that's a problem. And it doesn't seem to be a particular gain that someone else is having the opportunity to make these decisions and I'm not. So that's an inequality in terms of just the ability to make decisions that doesn't seem to benefit the least well off. And so he says we get democracy by adding fair opportunity to the difference principle. And that was in section 13. Lastly, just to really emphasize, in section 26, you get the Maximin principle. I've already hinted at this because we really kind of need it earlier. The Maximin rule, is that we're risk averse. As such, we're going to choose the least bad. Because if we don't know where we are, what position we're going to be in, we have to assume that we're the worst. Now, let me pause here. He doesn't defend this as much as I would like, because that's where I would stop the brakes and say, hey, Rawls, wait a minute. I know how inductive reasoning works. Imagine if you say, well, I'm not going to cross the street because the worst possibility is I get hit by a car I don't see. There's this worry of kind of maybe paralysis of inaction. And so I'm not, it's going to need a little more selling that it is somehow rational to always assume the least bad. So, for instance, imagine a situation in which, just to take a silly one, imagine a situation where there's an unequal policy that benefits everyone in society massively, except exactly one person who is harmed, and maybe even mildly. That's a hard sell to say. We shouldn't do it. Now, of course, here's the Rawlsian point. It's clearly unjust to hose that person for the benefit of everyone else. Again, think of killing an innocent person to take their organs to benefit others. Well, clearly, when it's 1 to 5, it doesn't work. But it's a harder sell to say, yeah, well, what if it's only a mild disadvantage and everyone else gains? It seems a little irrational to be risk averse at that point. And so that's kind of a little bit more utilitarian thinking, actually. And so if we want to try to figure out what Rawls might say about that kind of worry, you want to kind of re-scrutinize section 5. But it's really interesting to talk about to what, he's rejecting utilitarianism wholesale, whereas, there's kind of a redress. Well, what if we're really mild utilitarians about these kind of policies? It's an interesting thing to think about. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that as well. Otherwise, next time we have two good articles on discrimination. So make sure to check those out. I think they're pretty straightforward, so I'm just going to let you tackle them. But as you read them, maybe think about discrimination in terms of Rawls, because the veil of ignorance seems to wholesale block discrimination in certain ways. And so keep that in mind as you're reading through. And we'll talk to you next time.